Before you listen to this episode, I want to apologize for the poor audio quality that you will hear from my end. Unfortunately, I forgot to turn on my external mic before starting recording. The good news is that Anthea's audio is perfect, makes for actually one of our best episodes to date. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Slogans, the International podcast. I've been thinking about having today's guest on the podcast even before the first episode came out back in 2018. I remember she came to Leiden University's Hay campus on September 18, 2018, I guess, to present her groundbreaking work, Is International? And I was gutted for not being able to make it to the event, despite being in the city. 3 years later, it makes me really happy that I'm speaking with Dr. Anthea Roberts today on your slogans. For those who know Anthea and those who will get to know more about her through this episode, will realize that it's not a straightforward task to introduce her and or define her work. To say she's an international lawyer is to say Albert Einstein was a scientist. It tells a criminally bare story. Anthea Roberts, a professor at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, is a researcher and a legal scholar. Her research areas include public international law, international trade and investment, the effect of geopolitical change on global governance, and understanding and navigating complex systems. All that being said, I think she best describes herself as an intellectual nomad. Thank you so much, Dr. Anthea Roberts, for taking out time. I realized that you just had a new book came out and you're doing book launches and events. So yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to having a chat with you.
Great. So yeah, let's just get started right away. To begin with, I want to understand sort of your journey, your intellectual journey to what you're doing currently. I would like to start from perhaps your undergraduate, your higher education, where it got started, and what led you to do what you're doing right now.
Sure. So that takes me a couple of decades back, obviously. So I was, I guess, originally through school, a very strongly maths and physics kind of person, but on the side also did a lot of debating. And so when I went to university, I was caught between these two different sort of sciencey approaches and more artsy approaches. And I ended up settling on doing law and philosophy and mathematics as a combination. And so I did that as an undergraduate. I went over to Oxford, and when I went to Oxford to study law there, it didn't make any sense to study contract law or tort law because they didn't count for Australian contract law or tort law. So that was the first time I was exposed to international law and European Union law. Actually, at the time, I preferred European Union law, but my French was terrible. So I thought that international law was going to be a better option, which tells you a lot. And then I came home and I had to do a thesis in order to get honours. And this appalled me because I was somebody who really liked exams and did not like writing essays. Just didn't feel that were my strength, but had to do this. And so when I'd been in Oxford, I'd been a bit naughty about attending classes. And so the only lecture I'd gone to in international law was one on custom. And I went to this lecture and I just thought, this makes no sense at all. And so when I had to pick a thesis topic, I picked custom. So I found a thesis supervisor, Hilary Charlesworth, who's been a long-term mentor. And I said, I'd like to write on custom. And it's the sort of thing that if a student at 19 years of age comes in and says, I want to do a new theory of custom, like as a professor, you just think, oh my gosh, no. But to her credit, she said, you give that a try. And so that's what started. And that ended up being my first article in the field. And so that was as an undergraduate. I then went across and studied at NYU. I then chose not to do a PhD and to go into legal practice. So I went to work for a New York law firm and then moved across to London with that firm. But and I had an extraordinarily positive experience doing that. But after about 5 years, I'd always kind of thought I would become an academic. And so I jumped from a law firm to my first teaching position, which was at the London School of Economics. And when I was at the London School of Economics, probably after about a year, I got a call from Harvard asking if I would come across to teach there. So I went across and taught at Harvard. And while we were in Harvard, my husband, who's also an international lawyer, got a posting to New York. So got a call and went down to Colombia. And the sort of whole period overseas, which we thought would be about 2 years, turned into about 14. And at that point, trying to decide what to do next, we came home for some of my maternity leave and looked for jobs at home and ended up back in Australia. So that's what's brought me back to the Australian National University. But interestingly, to my first position outside of law school. So the School of Regulation and Global Governance had a number of really groundbreaking scholars that were more socio-legal or from different disciplines. Hilary Charlesworth was also here, John Braithwaite, Peter Drahos. And so I got to join this very interdisciplinary community that was looking quite broadly at issues about governance and regulation. So that's kind of the potted history.
All right, wow, that already explains quite a few things that were on my mind. So I want to understand a bit about the work that you do. And I think that's what everybody talks about, because the range of cross-disciplinary work and projects that you undertake are very diverse and they span across many disciplines and fields. There's a general tendency to bracket scholars, especially international scholars, into certain categories or schools of thoughts, whether it is mainstream scholarship or critical legal studies or branches like TWAIL. It is kind of difficult to do that with you because of the breadth and diversity of your endeavors. The sort of things that you do, nobody else does anything close to that. So how do you self-identify as in terms of your scholarship and your work? I like to have a bit of insight on that.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I would say I self-identify as extremely curious. I don't know if that sort of helps to provide a bit of a thread here.
No, that's a good answer.
Yeah, so I guess my parents would say when I was a kid that wherever I went, I would ask lots and lots of questions, and people would come away, like the electrician would visit and would say to my parents afterwards, oh, it's so clear she wants to be an electrician, and would go to the hairdresser and the hairdresser would say, from all the questions, it's so clear she wants to be a hairdresser, and the teacher would say she really obviously wants to be a teacher. But it wasn't really because I wanted to be an electrician or a hairdresser or a teacher. It was probably just because I'm extremely curious about the world around me. And so I'm interested in many things, and I try to follow my nose in terms of what I'm interested in. So I think that sort of partly explains the range of what I do. And I think I also like to experiment. So I like to, there's a sort of a knife edge between where I sort of feel like I know enough about a subject that I'm not completely terrified, and then I can be there for approximately 30 seconds and then I'm bored. So it's sort of both curious and a desire for movement and change and understanding. So I guess that's on the one hand, which helps to give a bit of a line to the scholarship. The other thing, though, about this is the camp. So what you've said there really reflects something somebody actually said to me just this week after I presented the new book at Cambridge. And they were reflecting, as a younger scholar, that they often felt like you had to join a tribe, and you either had to be doctrinal, or you had to be with the crits and the trailers, or you had to be with like law and economics. And if you didn't adopt a tribe, like you were homeless. And I think in many ways, I'm somebody that's never been particularly a part of any of the tribes, but I've got a deep curiosity about the different tribes. And so I think I tend to think that whenever you have a tribe about something, there's often a real reason for it, and they have a real insight, and that they have a really distinct and important perspective to understand. But I also often assume that their perspective is partial in some way. So I think a lot of the work that I do is not just driven by curiosity, it's kind of macro cognitive, in the sense that instead of answering first order questions or pledging allegiance to a particular tribe, I'm quite often interested in going that one level up and understanding kind of what are the different tribes and what is their worldview and what's important to them, and why do they completely not understand or completely detest that other tribe, and what is it that's sort of bringing that together. So I think a lot of my work is of that second order, and that probably helps to explain why I don't pledge allegiance within any tribe, but I actually like a lot of the different tribes. And my work is often of that second order nature.
Right. No, that's really interesting. I like what you said about the tendency to put people into tribes. I also feel it's sort of convenient, and it helps us understand people, what they're all about. So I'm wondering, how does that work? Because if, as you said, that you don't pledge allegiance to any sort of tribe or any group, you don't even. I mean, it's so interesting that, at least in my assessment, you're not even a full-time international lawyer. International law is just one thing that you do. How does that work?
So that's also been an evolving issue, right? So one of the things I think that's interesting to look at scholarly journeys is what changes and what stays the same. And so I would say that my subject area changes. And so that happened early on, looking at custom, looking at non-state actors, looking at jurisdiction, looking at investment. So a real change in subject area. And now as I'm sort of evolving, that's also then looking at like socio-legal approaches of is international law or international, and from there, global governance approaches and economics and political science. So sort of an evolving subject area, evolving disciplinary base kind of on the one hand. So that might sort of help to explain that a little bit. I would say that I still am interested very much in what you said at the beginning, which is sort of complex and evolving, often global fields. So I think I'm naturally drawn to global issues, but I think I'm also naturally drawn to complexity. So you've got all the things that change along the way, but what tends to remain the same? And I often think about this as kind of what is your scholarly DNA? And you can often tell scholarly DNA very, very early. I think I'm drawn to very complex, evolving and contested fields. And I'm drawn to sort of try to sort of understand different perspectives, different worldviews, but also emergent patterns in those fields. So if you go right back to the very first piece I wrote, which was sort of before I'd even done an LLM, I was looking at a really messy and contested field like custom. And I was trying to think, oh, there are all these debates here, but are you using the same language but meaning different things? Are there these sort of more traditional approaches? Are there more modern approaches? Which one's going up? Which one's coming down? How does it go? That sort of same scholarly DNA, I think you can also see in my first piece when I come back to the academy, when I look at the investment treaty system, I say, oh, there's kind of like within all this contestation, which are about all these primary issues, I think underneath that is people with different frameworks for understanding. Some see it as more public international law and they see this. Some see it as more commercial arbitration and they see this. And they're often influenced by their background and how they're socialized. And so when they come to a collision on a particular point and they both feel so strongly about that, it's often because they've got these different things embedded underneath them. The interesting thing about that kind of piece of continuity that comes through is it can apply to international law, but it can also apply to a lot of other things as well. And I think that's part of the process I'm going through at the moment, which is trying to understand where else I can use those skills in what other sort of complex and evolving fields.
Right. I think one would think that the sort of work that you do with macro frameworks and meta frameworks of sort in your books like Comparative International or Is International, even the new book, Six Faces of Globalization, one would feel that perhaps you would be looking at international law and areas on a superficial level. But the sort of work that you did with investment treaty arbitration, that's a very dense field. And I feel to a traditional doctrinal scholar, it might give them a heart attack the way you cross disciplines with such ease. So that fascinates me. I want to understand your process, your research process and your creative process. What goes on in your head while you're working, and what is that like?
So everyone's process is different. Everyone's process is natural and normal to them. So I always thought my process was quite normal, but I've had a number of co-authors recently who tell me that it's not a normal process. So I've started to think a little bit more.
It's not, and it's a good thing. It's not. You're very.
It's a bit of a weird process. So I think there are a lot of things behind it. So that I think the first thing is that I strongly follow gut instincts. So and I think you can look at this as something that's also been trained a little bit or socialized into me by both my family and my mentor, Hilary Charlesworth. So my family is extremely diverse and very pluralist. So if you follow me on Twitter, you might know that, like, so for example, my brother is a super heavyweight wrestler who does cage fighting and mixed martial arts. And so he and I, come from the same family stock, and yet what we've done on one level is so very, very different. But on another level, actually being a mixed martial arts fighter is a little bit like being an interdisciplinary scholar. It's about sort of breaking out of constraints and barriers. And so I think part of what might be common to both of us is, are you familiar with the hedgehog-fox distinction? So
no, I'm not.
Isaiah uses it to describe two different types of thinkers. So hedgehogs tend to have like one main organizing principle, and they see the world through that way, and they become absolute experts in that particular approach. Whereas foxes stitch together from many different sources, many different approaches to craft something that's much more eclectic. So I think I'm intellectually a fox at a time when, for various reasons in the academy, they're very strongly socializing and encouraging and incentivizing hedgehog behaviors. So most of us are a mix between hedgehog and fox, and I'm probably more naturally extreme as a fox. But part of what's happened in the academy in the last couple of decades is, through a whole variety of processes, we've made it much, much harder for foxes to be bred up within our system. The way that you often need to be in disciplines, the way that you need to publish within scholarly journals, which tend to be disciplinary based, the way that we do PhDs, which often ask you to be very narrow and kind of completely prove something small rather than, sketch something big. These are all things that produce very, very strong scholars, but they bias towards hedgehog and away from fox. But I think in any sort of healthy ecosystem, intellectually, you need like a whole range of foxes and hedgehogs. So I think I'm representative of that fox approach. But interestingly, I would say with the fox approach, it doesn't just mean going horizontally. If you actually want to do the kind of the complex and evolving work, you actually do what I think of as zooming. And so I remember, for example, when I presented the last book at Oxford, somebody was saying, I think Dapo Akonde was saying it was interesting to see that, sometimes I was zooming right into like how many cases were in there and what proportion and what pages were they on, then back up to like macro politics. And I kind of do the same like with my personal experiences in the field, like this is what happened. Then it made me think, what are the structural factors, and back and up and down. And so it doesn't tend to just be a horizontal top layer thing. It tends to be a zooming thing between the micro and the macro, and an iterative process. And that's actually what's partly led me to my work now on complexity theory, which gives a little bit more background about that sort of zooming approach.
Right. We'll talk about your the way you integrate different disciplines to solve complex problems. It kind of reminds me of the early days of the intellectual tradition, when everything was branched under philosophy, the natural sciences and social sciences. To look at a certain problem, philosophers used to do everything from maths to sociology to law to economics. It kind of reminds me of those early days in a good way, that we don't have those blinders on and just trying to look one-dimensionally at any given problem.
And so, can I just say that what you're saying there, so that's why I would say actually it's counterculture, it's like counter-cyclical. So I think I'm less usual as an academic in the academy today, but was probably more usual kind of a generation or so ago. So it just sort of moves with the time. But also I think what you're alluding to there also plays a really big role in the difference between exploration and exploitation. So hedgehog style thinking is really good for exploiting particular lines of knowledge and really kind of nailing them. Whereas a lot of the creative work that often happens in a much more exploratory way, where you move outside conventional dividers and disciplinary boundaries or existing categories. So I think there's a strong relationship there as well.
Yeah, of course. The few things that I like to pick your brain on in terms of your process. You have a very nice website, and it talks about your process and your creative thinking. I've seen in your work and also on your social media, you have a few inspirations in your work, whether it is nature or it is some sort of metaphorical or visual aids that you use repeatedly in all your work. How do you make use of these techniques and these tools to help clarify your thoughts to the people that are reading you? or listening to you?
So I think here it's quite helpful to think about the work of Howard Gardner, who did the work on multiple intelligences. So again, we see pluralism coming up. And his work was partly so revolutionary because intelligence had been thought to be like one thing that was represented in an IQ score. And he was able to say through all sorts of studies of psychology, but also what happened when people had different types of brain damage through to operations, all sorts of things, is actually able to identify at that stage 8 types of intelligence, and he's since added a few more. And so he distinguishes between some of the ones that we're very familiar with. So I said at the beginning, I liked maths and I also like debating, so that you've got your linguistic and you've also got your numerical intelligence, and some people are one side or other of those. But then people have very different types of intelligences. So some people have strong musical intelligence, some people have strong sort of spatial intelligence, or kinetic kind of physical intelligence. And I think it's really clear, and it's become clearer as I've gone on, that I have strong visual and metaphorical types of intelligence. And interestingly, I've now been in touch with Howard Gardner about this, who's also seen the new website. And one of his first reactions to my new book was, you could really see that Nicholas and I had this kind of visual and metaphorical intelligence, which was interesting because Howard himself does not actually have the visual intelligence, but he has very strongly musical intelligence, which I lack. And so I find it really interesting to see how different people have different types of intelligence. But also you kind of presented it as like an aid to explain to others. So I think what I would say about these sorts of intelligences is they're constitutive as well as communicative. So right. I use drawings and I use metaphors very self-consciously in my process to try to come up with my conceptualizations. And then I use them to explain them to other people. But almost all of my work first gets crystallized in these ways of seeing, either visually or metaphorically, and then it's a device I use to explain. And so that's why I think Howard's work on multiple intelligences is really helpful. Other people would do this in numbers, or they would do it through note taking, or they would do it through interpretive dance, right? So there are lots of different ways that people come to understand concepts. They now, with school kids that have trouble understanding chemical bonds of different chemicals, they get some kids to act it out in class, and you are hydrogen holding hands and a carbon comes in, and what happens. It just helps people understand in different kinds of ways. So I think, again, you sort of see that sort of instinct towards pluralism.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. How does the environment or nature, what role does that play in your life?
Look, so I think I just love nature. It's an aesthetic thing for me. It's a peaceful thing. So I'm out before sunrise pretty much every morning.
You're uploading pictures as well on your Twitter. And
yeah, so I love the natural environment. Australia, we're incredibly blessed, obviously, with the natural environment, but I find it's a really good place to kind of steady thoughts. I think there's so much that goes on in our world that's very fast-paced and stuff, and I think it's just really helpful to have these awe-inspiring, more grounded connections with nature. I think also at the moment I'm doing a huge amount of reading about sort of ecological ways of thinking. So I'm also sort of, and I think this is going to really clearly come out in my next body of work, and I think you're starting to see it happening in the investment treaty system at the moment. So I'm doing a lot of reading at the moment about fungus and trees and forest networks and kind of.
Yeah, I saw that on your what you're reading section on your website. Do you get a lot of ideas while you're walking outside?
Yeah, so absolutely, ideas crystallize while I'm outside. And I mean, they say often with thinking, you actually need to remove yourself. So I think often we almost think of the brain as like a machine, and just the longer I sit in front of a computer, the more hours I do, the more output I will have. I just think it's just not the right way to think about the brain. I think you often, if you're struggling with something and it's not quite working, you often need to change your environment. So physically remove yourself and go for a walk, or go and see something beautiful, or read something really different. So I was just saying, my co-author today, we're struggling to reformulate one of our papers, which is on the investment treaty system. And I could just feel it was meant to be my day to write, but it just wasn't gelling. So I went off and read about mushrooms instead. So at the end of the day, when I called her, she was expecting to have an answer to our paper. I told her some really interesting stuff I found out about fungus. I'm sure that it will continue to sit in the back of my mind, and then there will come the time when I'm ready to sit down and it will come. So I sort of use it as a process, not just for inspiration, but also to percolate things in the back. And I think if you look at many people who have a creative process, this is quite a common thing that people do. They take time away, they talk to people, they look at nature, and somehow these things work in the subconscious and you have your aha moment, you hope.
Do you read fiction as well?
So I'm not a huge fiction reader. So I'm incredibly keen on reading nonfiction across a lot of diverse fields, but I'm not such a huge fiction reader. So I run a couple of book reading groups on different subjects at work, and I also run a book club outside of work.
Wow.
And I've got a really...
Is there anything that you don't do?
No. So I've got a really terrible
Okay, yeah, you don't read
reputation.
fiction. So that's one thing.
So about every time there's a fiction book, I somehow manage to not read it. But there are other people in the group who every time it's a non-fiction book, they don't read it. So it's just a kind of a no judgment rule. So yeah, I find I know that fiction is great, but it's just not moving me at the moment. But these things can change. Like I used to always say, like I liked everything except history, and I've recently become more interested in history. So, it's relatively open.
Fascinating. There's so much that I want to talk about that we have already discussed, but I guess that the few other things that we that I want to talk about as well with you. So let's address the elephant in the room. Is international law international? What happened there? You took the academy by storm. A lot of people were just like dumbfounded. What has she done? So what was the big idea behind the book? How did it come about? And were you surprised by what you found while you were researching for it?
Yeah. Why do you say dumbfounded?
As in, I think it challenged a lot of assumptions in terms of So there were a few things that people like. For example, I studied law in Pakistan. And I took a few international courses as well in international, and there was one which was called International from the South, and I remember clearly that we had no indigenous or local books. The books that we were reading were either by Malcolm Evans or Malcolm Shaw. They were very Western oriented. The case law and everything, it was grounded in the West, and I sort of had this intuition that perhaps it is just Pakistan, where we don't have enough authors or scholarship. That's why we are reliant on Western scholars. But the way you tracked the academy and the flow of information in international specifically, that there are certain centers that are dominating the narrative, and there are certain centers like China and Russia whose works are not being translated into the Western world because of a language and cultural barrier. So it sort of gave voice to a lot of our ideas or assumptions, if I may. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So interestingly, I come from this global South experience. I was an Australian who then studied and worked in sort of started in the academy in the UK. And so my experience was really, really different. So it seemed relatively seamless to me at that stage. I'd studied law in the UK, I went back to teach in the UK. And I guess my assumption was like international law, what it said on the tin, that it was international. And then when I had the experience of going across and teaching at Harvard, I needed to teach the first year's international law. And so I needed to set a textbook, and I could have set the ones that we'd used at the LSE, but I knew in the US that they were used to this case-based method. So I thought, look, I'll pick an American international law textbook because it'll have the case-based method that the students are familiar with. But it didn't really occur to me that the subject would be different, because I was thinking like it's international law, but it's just case-based. And so suddenly I was setting the readings for each week, and I would obviously, as the teacher, do the reading first. And so I was doing this reading, and it was just so different. And so I was reading all of these Supreme Court cases, which I hadn't read before, and having to establish them. I was thinking, like, this is just not the international law I know. This is incredibly domestic, and it's hugely American. And so I think from that outsider perspective, I kind of had that first reaction of like, A, this is different when I didn't expect it to be. B, like, if it's going to be different between the US and UK, like, they are two of what you would think were the most similar countries, like core English-speaking Western. So if I'm seeing differences there, what does it mean for elsewhere? And then I was noticing it wasn't just the textbooks, right? There were all sorts of socializing effects that meant that kind of what I was socialized in the UK Academy to write on and to publish and where to publish was just hugely different to what I was seeing with my American colleagues, which was just making me aware, even within this English-speaking communities, that they were so different. So it just became a bit of a puzzle for me. And so I started that road. And I guess one of the things that was the most interesting to me in that road was it put me in that outsider position to start to inquire. And then some of the things I inquired supported instincts I'd had, but others were like a complete slap in the face. So I remember, I don't know if you remember the book, I had various pie charts. And so one of them with the pie charts I had was sort of how domestic the cases were, how international and how foreign. And I remember at those, it really kind of reaffirmed my sense that the US ones were unbelievably domestic, right? And then like the French ones were very French and international, but not comparative. And then I got to UK and to my home sort of Australia, and I saw kind of international, comparative, and domestic. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of what I expect. And I remember looking at that pie chart, feeling like good about myself as an international lawyer. And then I asked myself the question, like, what percentage of those cases are Western? And I knew that the field had a Western bias to it. Like I kind of knew that a little bit. But when the statistics came back at like 99%, I just felt like looking at those two pie charts, on the first pie chart, I saw my strengths as an international lawyer. And on the second pie chart, I just got this overwhelming mirror held back at myself about my extraordinary weaknesses. And that was just it was a really unsettling but productive experience to have. So I started to think, well, kind of, what does it look like if you come from China? What does it look like if you come from Russia? What does it look like if you've come from India? Do you even have any domestic cases in your textbooks from India? Or where do your textbooks come from? And what does it mean if you're in India or Pakistan and you're learning from English textbooks? So it became like an exploratory, imaginative journey about what international looked like from different places.
Right. I find it very fascinating that given your context and your background, that you were educated in the Western world, you were curious enough to ask these questions that nobody was asking. And I was watching your presentation on the book at Harvard Law School recently, because it's been a while since I read the book. So I was just revising, and I felt that perhaps your shock at the flawed understanding of US Supreme Court's understanding of international law maybe pushed you to explore it further, that how is it possible that it seems like that international law is being interpreted in the light of domestic law rather than the other way around, as a lot of people might do it. So yeah, how did that curiosity, till so far we have established that you're a very curious person. But yeah, I'm just fascinated to understand that how did the book come about, and how did it all materialize?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say, so when you say no one was asking these questions, of course, there have been scholars in many parts of the world, and including from the Global South. You've had TOEL approach.
But not in the mainstream scholarship. It was mostly TOEL scholars or CLS scholars, and yeah.
Yeah, and that, so there are many people who've had different perspectives, which have often been not in the mainstream. I think part of what was different here was you had somebody coming from within the mainstream, but also often when it comes from Twail or from the crits, it comes as a real attack, whereas this came as an exploration from within. So that also changes like the kind of way it's explained, and then that also changes kind of how people hear it. So if you've got things that come from the outside and are attacks, I think they often resonate less than if you've got something that comes from within that posits a question. And a number of some people critique me for not doing it as like a more political attack, but it actually wasn't a political attack from me, and it's not my style anyway. It was genuinely reflective of my journey, and a journey of discovery, but also a journey of where I wanted to follow where the facts took me, and I wanted to be open to where the facts took me. And the facts took me well past anything I would have ever thought at the beginning. So first of all, this was never meant to be a scholarly paper. So this started out as something I discussed over cocktails about how crazy I found some of the American international law stuff. But it then sort of it turned into what was originally meant to be quite a short sort of satirical essay about my experience in the field. But once I started writing, there was just so much to say. And once I started looking, there were so many things that I hadn't questioned before. And that's really what kind of led to the book. And I then obviously got pushed back from a number of people who didn't like some of what the book suggested about the field and about the academy. So that I definitely received a lot of pushback about that. But I think it was a pretty honest reflection of what I was finding and the kind of questions that was raising for me. And I think that's probably what resonated. And so is the unusual thing not to ask the question, or is the unusual thing to try to answer the question even if people don't like the answer? I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting one. And given the fact that you could have even explored it further in like areas of Latin America and Africa, if you had the time to do that, perhaps people would have been more unhappy with you. But yeah, it's great. Let's move on to your new book, Faces of Globalization, which you have co-authored with Nicholas Lamb, and it's already come out last month, if I'm not wrong. It has been published. So you have to tell me a bit about that, and how does the Rubik's Cube fit in all of this?
Sure. So this was a book that kind of happened in response originally to the election of Donald Trump and to Brexit. And this was a moment where kind of globalization, as we knew it, economic globalization, really came under siege and under attack. And I think Nicholas and I, we were working separately at the time. We didn't know each other. We both saw these, and we both saw kind of members of the establishment really just being like, these stupid people who don't understand, and like, it's ignorance and it's all this sort of stuff. And I guess our instinct was that there was something in these critiques, even if you didn't like the messengers or you didn't like the methods, there was something in these critiques that we needed to better understand. And so I originally wrote a blog post sort of explaining the difference between like a Trump view and a Sanders view by reference to Branko Milanovich's elephant graph. And this was something that Nicholas saw. He remembers reading it, I think he says, on a train while he was starting to work on his approaches to narratives and thinking there's something similar between what we're doing. So he was working on one about an establishment narrative, a protectionist Trump narrative, and a corporate power narrative. And then we kept working separately for a while, and I became very conscious of this sort of growing what I thought of as a geoeconomic narrative. So I was developing that. And then a friend, Wolfgang Auschner, kind of put us in contact and said, you two should really talk to each other. So we just started batting around with each other what these different ideas were and how you would organize them. And we started adding additional narratives in and trying to work out what was the underlying structure between all of them. And we ended up coming up with 6 narratives, kind of a win-win one, a lose-lose one, and various win-lose ones. And as I was jogging around the lake, actually, this structure, it's sort of, I remember the time I was visualizing a globe, like a global approach in a globe. And I was thinking kind of, how do you get traction on a globe? You know, you often need to have like a plane of reality. And I was thinking about the globe and cutting planes of reality. And that kind of got me to a cube. And I suddenly realized that our 6 faces actually fitted onto a cube with the win-win on top, the lose-lose on the bottom, and 4 faces of win-lose narratives. And so that's how we ended up putting it onto a Rubik's Cube, of sort of saying we had started off with these really scrambled debates, but actually we can unscramble the Rubik's Cube into this meta framework to understand these 6 narratives. So we go from establishment narrative, which is the win-win approach to globalization. We've got these 4 win-lose ones, which do left-wing populism, right-wing populism, geoeconomics and corporate power. And then one of the ones that neither of us had done previously, which is this lose-lose narrative, is really kind of trying to understand the relationship between globalization and global threats. So climate change, pandemics. And that originally started as climate change. And during the course of the book, we obviously experienced the pandemic, which was another example of this. So in some ways, the book kind of has that similar approach of kind of empathetic perspective taking and integrative complexity and macro frameworks, but it's applied largely to economic globalization debates. But I would also say it's largely applied to economic globalization debates in the West. That's where you saw the really acute pushback against economic globalization. It doesn't look like that, I think, in several other places around the world. So it's got a similar approach, perhaps, to is international or international, but is international or international was subconsciously from different countries from around the world, whereas this is primarily about the Western debates with an acknowledgement of the blind spots and biases of those debates.
All right. No, thank you. When I was reading the excerpt that you shared with me of the book as well, I was very anxious. I was like, these 6 narratives, when you must be researching, this might have been a concern that are we overgeneralizing reality, because economics and globalization is so complex and there's so many varying factors that do these 6 narratives cover everything, every important aspect of economic globalization that we need to cover? And if it does not, then are we at the risk of making an argument which is not informed, has enough evidence to back it up? So was that a concern while you were doing this? I know you thrive in creating meta and macro frameworks to understand complex realities. So it must be easier for you compared to anybody else. But yeah, how was that?
Look, there's no right answer to this. Like, there's no magic number. There are 6 and only 6, and it had to be this 6. You could group them in other ways. You could introduce other things. So this is not scientific in the sense that there is a right answer about how many narratives there are about economic globalization. Instead, what you want to do is you want to do something that kind of captures and makes sense of a reality people have. So what I hope happens when people read these 6 narratives is they think, I know that narrative. Like, I intuitively recognize that, but actually now that I have them put all together, I not only know my narrative, but I can actually recognize other narratives I'm less familiar with and kind of understand them a bit from the inside. And I can think about how these narratives intersect. So part of what we do is we look at how you mix and match different narratives. What happens when different narratives overlap? What happens if you take a kind of a more kaleidoscopic approach? And we also look at some of the things that you just don't see as much in the Western debate. So we'd actually had originally 4 chapters on some of the different non-Western narratives. In the editing process, they asked us to bring that back to 1 about the blind spots and biases. So it's the longest chapter in the book, but only 1 chapter. But that was about also making the point that anything like this is going to be kaleidoscopic. It's going to look different to different people in different places. And so I think all of the narratives we have a really solid basis in the Western debates. And I think it's, could you group some of them differently? Yes. Are there things in the Western debates that are neglected? Yes. But is this a sort of a helpful structure for understanding what the debates are and how they're looking at different levels of analysis, different units of analysis, how they're expressing different values? We found it really helpful. And partly the interesting experience of finding this really helpful is, as we went through this process and as new things came into the news or COVID or things like that happened, we actually found this template gave us a really helpful way to analyze and unpack new issues as they were emerging, and actually to almost have a predictive function. So when COVID happened, I remember people were really trying to make sense of it. And actually through the different narratives we had, we could almost predict what proponents of the different narratives were going to say and how they were going to read COVID. And it played out really strongly as we were in those very early stages predicting. So is it 100% foolproof? Absolutely not. No project like this could be. But do I hope it will have resonance with people? And do I think it will? I do. I think it does capture something. And I found it really helped me better understand economic globalization.
Do you feel overwhelmed when you're undertaking ambitious projects like this?
Yeah, so this was an issue that Nicholas and I both had, and I think at times he particularly felt like, oh, there's so much to read here, and how do we do it? So I would say, yeah, look, these projects are scary. Part of what was scary about this project was it was so big. Part of what was scary about this project was it was our first real step away from law. So you're doing something that's big, you're doing something that's interdisciplinary, you're doing something that's fast moving. So all of those things are slightly terrifying. But look, I sort of think of scholarship as a little bit more playful. Like we were curious, we were learning, we were making discoveries. We hoped it would come together.
Yeah, and then you don't seem like a person who's afraid of taking risks.
So I think I'm a higher risk taker. I think that's definitely true. And I think there are a lot of things in the academy at the moment that sort of condition us not to take risks. But I think if you want to push yourself, and if so I'm very drawn to artists that took risks and did really novel things and were really experimental and often weren't well received during their careers, and often weren't well received until after they died. Like, I think I'm interested in experimentalism. I'm interested in pushing the boundaries. I kind of recognize that if you take those risks, you're going to fail sometimes. You're going to get pushback. You're going to get critique from hedgehogs. That's going to be part of the game.
So do you feel that these hedgehogs, they try to tell you that you need to stick to one field? You can't be doing international law and geopolitics and global governance at the same time. You need to choose a path and focus all your efforts towards that.
So I think that's the messaging in a lot of the academy, but I also think there's going to be a counter movement to this, right? So we learn at the moment in the last generation a lot about specialization and exploitation and kind of pushing the boundaries within a particular thing, but we're starting to see works like range and various other ones that are really starting to draw on the importance of this kind of cross-cutting work. And it's really clear in studies of innovation and creativity that this kind of work is more likely to stimulate creativity and like pushing the envelope, that you're more likely to get originality from outsiders, you're more likely to get it from the foxes. So I think we're due for a bit of a course correction at some point, in the next 10 to 20 years. I also think that we, at the moment, we're really privileging asking and really well answering narrow questions. But actually, if you want to sort of understand complex and evolving things like climate change or like what's happening with geopolitics, you have to approach them and answer them in a different way, which is more experimental, more open, more humble. Like, you can't prove it, you can't be 100% right. And so I think we need to make space in our academy for that kind of work. And so, I don't think this bothers me as much for me personally. I think I'll continue to do the kind of work I do. But it bothers me the kind of messaging we send to our younger scholars, that there are only certain types of work that you can do. And I think we need to stand up for the idea that in a diverse ecosystem, you need different types of work. And, and that doesn't just mean critical or empirical, but it can mean fox and hedgehog. And it could also mean different tempos of scholarship. So some people want to produce 2 or 3 or 4 articles a year. Some people want to produce a book every 4 years, right?
Yeah.
For a diverse ecosystem, we need to value those choices.
That's very well said. And I feel for that reason, a lot of people in the academy and otherwise, they resonate with your work because they feel like perhaps there's a need of the hour to look beyond what we have been doing so far. Because a lot of these complex problems like climate change and even globalization, they can't be just addressed by looking at it from a single discipline. Um, Before we move on to the latter part of the discussion, and I'm very respectful of your time as well. Um, Coming back to the Rubik's cube and the six narratives, I liked how you qualified the overarching structure and the framework as well by saying that oftentimes people do this strategic switching of narratives, that they jump from one narrative to another one to suit their convenience. So it's not like these six narratives are completely independent of each other or they operate in silos. They overlap quite often. How do you see that?
Yeah, so the first part of the book is really to unscramble the Rubik's Cube and to kind of give these ideal types of the six narratives and what's driving them, what are their motives, what are their structures. And then the second half of the book really looks at kind of how do you play with these narratives? So we give examples, exactly as you say, of actors strategically switching, where they're being presented as the bad guy under one narrative phase, and they sort of switch to another narrative where they become one of the good guys, or you change the unit of analysis or the measure, so it shifts the idea of the problem. We see this happening a lot at the moment on debates about China. Is the problem domestic inequality, or is it the external of China, and is it corporate power, or is it geoeconomics? So we see that happening, I think, a lot, and we give examples of that. But I think part of what we found interesting as well by doing the different narratives is what happens when they overlap. So we have various analyses. Nicholas led a really good analysis, I think, in the book that looks at the NAFTA negotiations and looks at the overlaps of the different narratives leading to support at different points in the process for different concrete proposals that ended up in the draft that were accepted or that weren't, that had to have at least overlap of two of the narratives, but then the parties would change and it went to a different one. But I think it also made us think much more clearly about the kind of tensions and trade-offs and underlying assumptions of the different narratives. So it made us much more conscious that the idea that you have a single pie and it's just about growing the pie and dividing the pie just doesn't really answer some of the value conflicts that are inherent here. And we really saw a tendency to, for example, assume that those who supported Trump were arguing against their economic well-being and were being stupid or were being hoodwinked in a way that kind of didn't I think listen to some of the cultural values that were being espoused. And it doesn't mean that that's all right, but that there were some things there that I think people weren't empathetically listening to each other on, and we saw that happening a lot. And once you listen to those different values, you also become much more conscious of the kind of trade-offs we're going to need to be making. Like, there are going to be real trade-offs, and we're seeing this now in trade policy, where it's not just about free trade and economic efficiency. They're trying to weigh that against, climate emissions and human rights and national security and technological competition. These are very different kinds of political trade-offs that were not as openly discussed in the previous era. And so the Rubik's Cube gives us a bit of a way to walk people through some of these different kind of decision-making points that they're going to be needing to make in policymaking. And I do a lot with policymakers in a variety of different states. And I can tell you that this kind of collision of different interests that are asking them to remix the Rubik's Cube, you absolutely see this in policymaking at the moment.
Right. Tell me a bit about the kaleidoscope approach that you mentioned earlier. And there's another thing that you talk about in your creative process, which is the dragonfly thinking. I was watching your launch of the book on Harvard International Journal Symposium, I think. And in one of the last slides, you present that shifting kaleidoscope. What's that about?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always an evolving process. So I'll tell you about the dragonflies, and then I'll tell you about the kaleidoscope. So the dragonflies was we've done the full draft of this book, And we were meant to actually be going to workshop it, but the coronavirus happened, and so we couldn't go to any of the workshops. And so we're very, very grateful. A number of people gave comments on the draft. And two of the people that gave comments on the draft that came from wildly different backgrounds. So one was a political scientist and the other was a consultant at a management consultancy firm in London. So two very, very different people both read our draft and said, "You're very Tetlock." And I was like, who is Tetlock? So I went away and read Tetlock, and I thought to myself, we're very Tetlock, and it hadn't really occurred to me before. And so Tetlock talks about effectively Fox-style thinkers, and he talks about the idea of dragonfly eyes. So dragonflies don't just have two eyes, they have thousands of lenses in those two eyes. And from that, they actually integrate a sort of more holistic view, almost a 360-degree view of reality. And so he actually found in his work on super forecasters, the people who were much more accurate at giving forecasting predictions, that they tended to have this quality of having dragonfly eyes. And suddenly the sort of penny dropped about my intellectual DNA going the whole way back, which is most of my projects are effectively dragonfly eye projects. So I differentiate. So you've got two different steps. Your first is you differentiate multiple different perspectives. So you see things through different lenses, different approaches. And that often requires empathetic perspective taking, seeing many shades of gray, seeing many different approaches. So that's a differentiation function. But the second thing you do is you integrate it to try and create a more holistic viewpoint. So you look at tensions and trade-offs, you create frameworks, you work out how things fit together. And so that's not just the 6 narratives, but putting it on the Rubik's Cube and understanding how the different ones relate to each other. So it's a bit of a penny drop moment for me of thinking this is kind of my intellectual DNA that we see in this book, but I think we see more generally. The Kaleidoscope, though, is also part of an intellectual journey that's sort of in the background of writing this book. I've been doing much more work on geoeconomics and also then on the investment treaty system. And in the process of doing that, I've become increasingly interested in complexity science and was reading a lot of physics papers about networks and complexity science and trying to better understand what happened in places like the Santa Fe Institute. I became like totally fascinated with this and realized that a lot of my stuff was really about looking at complex systems, emergent patterns, unpredictable behaviors. And so I realized from doing all of that actually the Rubik's Cube wasn't really quite the right metaphor for me, because the Rubik's Cube was a mechanical thing that had like a solution. But actually on most of the things I was looking at, they didn't have a solution. They were sort of more organic. And so there's no organic toy, right? But we introduced the Kaleidoscope to sort of say, it's not just as simple as having one solution and solving it and getting the 6 different narratives. We need to understand that they can fragment, they can change, and that it's a little bit more like a kaleidoscope that doesn't have a solution, doesn't have a single answer. But every time you turn the dial, those shifting patterns, like those fragments, shift and you see a different image, and you can constantly keep turning that around. And so we do that to the coronavirus, we do that to climate change, we do that to some of the different policy conundrums to say kind of, if you start to think of these narratives like in a kaleidoscope and you try to look at it and turn the dial in various ways, what do you see? How do you see things in the round? How can things fragment and recoalesce, and what might that look like going forward? So both of those aspects of the book really came partly from reactions from other people that kind of led to more reading, and partly from a broader intellectual journey that I've been going on of just having a very deep interest in complexity science.
Fascinating. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around your process and how complex and wide-ranging it is. More on this in both of your recent books in international is international and 6 Faces of Globalization. You seem to transcend beyond your own individual context as a Western scholar in terms of your education, your training, and where you're based, to sort of unpack perspectives that may be very distinct from your own, whether it is studying the Chinese or Russian academy or studying the different narratives of globalization. So how do you examine these in their own context and their own settings without sort of being influenced by your own existing intellectual framework and your natural biases?
So I don't think any of us can get away from our existing frameworks and our natural biases. I think all of us are affected by that. I think there are things you can do to try to to help counter that process. So psychologists talk about sort of active open-mindedness. And so some people are more actively open-minded in terms of both searching for new perspectives, but also being more accepting of new perspectives. So I think a lot of my work has that active open-mindedness quality to the search. And that means trying to read things from very diverse sources in a sort of more open-minded way and trying to kind of imagine what it looks like from there. It often also means developing friendship networks with people from these different communities. And just as I would ask plumbers and hairdressers, I ask them about their experiences and what they see. And, so I would ask a lot of questions about, I found this, why is that? Like, how did you think about it? Like, what did you think as a scholar? Like, what happened when you were in China and you were doing the Jessup Mood? And when you read this, what did you think? And kind of when you got to the US, how did that make you feel? And like, I noticed this, like, was that different? Or I saw this. And so it becomes kind of an iterative process. The other thing I've really noticed since the last book is I talked to a lot of people in coming up with it, but it's been really clear to me since the book came out, so many people have written to me about their experiences as international lawyers in different fields, including people who are really senior that you wouldn't expect would reflect this. And many people have these real psychological journeys that they've been through, and you're sort of tapping into some of that, even in ways that you don't really know. So I've had quite strong reactions from people who've had those experiences. So I don't quite know what that is. I'm still kind of sorting that out. It doesn't mean I get it 100% right all the time. I definitely don't. And there are limitations to this approach. And you have to, you can't avoid there being limitations in this approach.
Right.
But you also hope that you're capturing an essence or a different perspective through trying to situate yourself in different places.
Before I let you go, there's a lot of fluidity in your thoughts, your writing, and in your scholarship, and you sort of thrive on cutting across disciplines. As we see that you work on law, economics, political science, sociology, and security studies. How have you developed this skill to work across disciplines on a consistent basis?
Yeah, so this is so I've always read relatively broadly. So I think of it a little bit like a tree. So often you come up within a particular field and a particular discipline, that's you kind of going up the trunk. But if you want to start to sort of branch out in your scholarship and do other things, it really helps to have a strong network of roots underneath you. So the strong network of roots that sort of helps to support that is definitely, I think, diverse reading. So one of the things that happened, I think, particularly after my last book, was the combination of having finished that big project and also being in this new interdisciplinary environment. It just felt like the walls came down for me a bit, and I felt really hungry to read from very different backgrounds. And I also tried to give myself permission to take that time. So I started buying many more books because I was getting more interested in books. I started reading across many more diverse domains. And that's really what's led to my current projects. I'm still trying to work out the method of that. So the next book I want to write, tentatively called Thinking Global, is actually trying to unpick a bit of this method, because I've done a lot of reading now and have a lot of thoughts about what this process is and how you do it and what its strengths and weaknesses might be and how you might develop it in the academy. But that's not something I haven't quite crystallized yet. So I've got tons of ideas on it yet, but they're still in draft.
Dr. Anthea Roberts, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking your time for this conversation. I'm glad that after years of thinking about it, I finally got around to it and was able to convince you to take part in this. I absolutely loved it. And thank you for being on the podcast. I wish you well with your book tour and launches. I'm sure it's going to be exhausting. Good luck with all of that.
Thank you for having me.